Truth is a pathless land, and you cannot approach it by any path whatsoever, by any religion, by any sect. Many would agree with the words of Jiddu Krishnamurti, the great Indian philosopher, but it hasn't stopped people trying. Such men as Plato in the West and Confucius in the East strove to understand how the world worked and how people could live the best possible life within it. To some, it may seem odd that Jiddu Krishnamurti should be so dismissive of religion, for he came from a land that produced two of the great world belief systems, Hinduism and Buddhism. Whence this creation has arisen, perhaps it formed itself, or perhaps it did not. The one who looks down on it in the highest heaven, only he knows. Or perhaps he does not. Hinduism has its origins in the Indus Valley, about 1500 years before the birth of Christ. Indeed, the word Hindu comes from the Persian name of the river. Nomadic Aryans began to settle down in the valley, where their culture mixed with that of the indigenous people.
Arya in Sanskrit means noble one, and therefore Aryan, which is an English form of Arya, means those who had a noble scripture, a noble language, and a noble vision of the world. So that's really what Aryan signified. And we don't know exactly when they originated, but we do know that in the Indian context, they appeared on the scene more or less in their present form, round about the beginning of the first millennium before the Common Era.
Archaeological findings show that these early people practiced personal and ritual cleanliness.
I don't think there was any ancient civilization that was so sophisticated in the control of water. They were able to store water, they were able to flush systems for hygiene, they were able to carry water from one part of the urban complex to another, and that is one of their most outstanding achievements in their ancient civilization. The Aryans, it seems to me, whoever they were, and this is a matter of great political and scholarly debate, the Aryans, in their synthesis with the local culture, took on board many of these ritual practices, and pollution and so on became an important part of the Aryan perception of the world.
Hinduism has many different forms, lifestyles, and practices. However, it has never been a missionary religion. It still remains chiefly tied to Indian culture and peoples spread throughout the world. A major strand of Hindu belief is centered on the Brahman, or universal soul. It is both the essence that underlies the whole world and the soul of each individual.
Now, Brahman comes from a Sanskrit word, brihati, which means to grow. And therefore, Brahman is the great one. And as you would expect in a very ancient religious tradition, which Hinduism reflects, Brahman has undergone different meanings in the development of its understanding and so on. So early on, Brahman was understood as the power. at the center of the sacrifice, which was at the center of Vedic religion, which is the earliest form of Hinduism. And in the course of time, the Brahman, which was the power in the sacrifice, was understood to be the power and the inner principle of the human being, as well as the inner principle of the multifaceted world around us. And in the final portion of the Vedic text called the Vedanta or Upanishads, this inner principle or Brahman inside one and outside one was regarded as just one principle of being, of existence. And so later on, it more or less did the job of the supreme being or God.
The 8th century philosopher Shankar believed that the material world was ultimately an illusion.
One of the great theologians and philosophers, if you wish, of Brahman in the Hindu tradition was Shankara. And Shankara was a monist. That means he believed that ultimately there was only one reality, and that this was Brahman. So how do you explain the whole world of difference in which we live, with all its changes and with all its moods and with all its suffering and joys? For Shankara, that was the empirical level, the level of sense experience. And he didn't deny that. From that point of view, you could call him a realist. In other words, on the empirical level of everyday life and everyday experience, all this around us exists. You exist, I exist, and all the difference of the world exists. The problem is if we regard that as the end point of experience, and if we say that that's all there is, and if we open our eyes and see and say, well, what I see is what I get. For Shankara, that wasn't the case. What I see is not the ultimate reality, because underlying everything, unifying everything, is the principle of Brahman. And the goal of human existence is to see through the difference of the world and realize that the principle of Brahman, this unitive principle, is all that ultimately exists. So that when you get enlightenment, when you get liberation for Shankara, the difference of the world is something that becomes transparent. You see through it to the principle of Brahman under it.
Shankar was a member of the Vedanta school of philosophy. They specialized in the critical interpretation of the mystical texts called Upanishad. Other Vedanta schools opposed Shankar. One of his most prominent opponents was Ramanuja, who lived from 1017 to 1137.
2 or 3 centuries later, Ramanuja came on the scene. Now, we said earlier that Shankara was a monist. That is, he believed that ultimately there was only one principle of being, not two, and that was Brahman. Ramanuja was not a monist, and this is where he disagreed with Shankara. Ramanuja was a kind of dualist. He believed that there were two principles of being. We can call them the finite and the infinite. The creaturely state of being, and then the infinite state of being. And that infinite state was Brahman. He also called it Brahman, though he gave it a personal name, which was Vishnu Narayana, just as Christians give God a personal name. And Ramanuja was, in that sense, a theist. He believed in the existence of God, or Brahman, who has a personal nature. So this is where he and Shankara disagreed in a very important way. Because for Shankara, ultimately, if there's only one principle of being, then there's no difference between God and us. And there's no room, therefore, for a devotional way of life in the strict sense of the term, because you need two principles of existence for devotion, the object of devotion and the devotee. And though Shankara agreed that on the empirical or everyday level, you can project God, Brahman's human or personal face, as it were, can be God, ultimately the difference dissolves. Not for Ramanuja. For Ramanuja, the difference between us and God always remains. Though we see more and more clearly that can never be removed. And so in that sense, he's a theist. There's one other important difference. Ramanuja, because he was a theist, I think, gave a much more positive evaluation of the world in which we live. This is God's world. And in fact, he used a very interesting image of that. He said, this world is the body of God, and we are all the body of God. And obviously, we look after our bodies and nurture our bodies and care for our bodies. And therefore, if you want to extend this idea in today's ecological terms, then we are custodians and guardians of the world.
The Aryans brought with them their sacred religious texts, the Veds. The sacred Hindu texts cover every aspect of life. The word comes from Sanskrit and means knowledge. They were transmitted orally and were known as Shruti, which means hearing. Both the content and the sounds of the words are considered sacred. Hindus often recite verses from these texts during their daily meditation.
They are written in this powerful and mystical language called Sanskrit in English, but Samskrita in the original tongue. And Samskrita means refined, polished, well wrought, perfected. So that's why they had this special power in them. It was an oral tradition, and therefore the Vedas were not put down in writing, because the ancient Hindus believed, even today the belief is still quite prevalent, that writing in a way takes away the power of the sound. And so Hinduism remains an oral tradition which has derived from the force and the power of the Vedas. So there were utterances, sacred utterances, a large body of utterances which enable the individual to control the world, the powers of the world, and the powers of the human being. In that sense, if you resonated with the Vedas in Sanskrit, you resonated with your deepest self and with the world around you.
Hinduism follows a moral code set down by saints and heroes. Set thy heart upon thy work, but never upon its reward. At the center of this system of ethics are the concepts of dharma and karma.
One way that the early Hindus, and by that I mean already before the Common Era, from around about the 3rd, 4th century BCE, one way that the early Hindus organized their understanding of human goals and what we would call today human fulfillment is in terms of 4 categories or 4 objectives of human living. Dharma, which means righteous living. Kama, which means satisfaction, gratification. Artha, which meant wealth. And moksha, which is the horizon of these 3 and which is often translated as liberation. Now, the precise order of the first 3, dharma, artha, kama, can vary in different texts. But moksha is always a kind of horizon of the other 3. And dharma also has a special position with regard to the other 2, artha and kama. Because, take for example, artha, which is the pursuit, has been translated in fact in modern times as the pursuit of prosperity, of wealth, of standing in the world. This is a legitimate human goal. Now, according to the thinkers and reflectors on the tradition, you can't pursue wealth apart from righteous living, righteous conduct. So again, dharma comes in there as a controller of the pursuit of wealth. Or if you look at the other objective or goal, kama. Kama has often been regarded as sexual pleasure or sexual satisfaction, but that's not the full meaning of kama. Kama just means satisfaction, human satisfaction, and the satisfaction we derive from sense experience, of which sex is one. But even there, you cannot pursue kama independently of dharma, of righteous living. So dharma in that sense acts as a control, whereas moksha, or liberation, acts as the ultimate goal of human existence for many theologians. And once you experience karma, or satisfaction, and you've established yourself in the world through artha, or wealth, or social standing. Once you have the path of dharma, or righteous living, the ultimate objective is, in a way, transcending these more limited goals and achieving the goal of liberation from the world in which we live, in which dharma, artha and kama sort of hold sway. So in that sense, moksha is the ultimate goal. Though for many, many Hindus who believe in rebirth, moksha is quite a distant goal. And they believe that it takes time to actually acquire that insight where moksha becomes the overriding objective of human existence. So as long as you, in the meantime, follow artha and kama, that is human satisfaction in a legitimate way and well-being in a legitimate way through dharma, and that is acceptable.
The Hindu's ultimate goal is spiritual liberation. True knowledge of the self brings freedom from an attachment to the material world and the cycle of rebirth. Hinduism accepts a variety of spiritual paths to salvation. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna commends 3 disciplines, or yogas: knowledge, action, and devotion. The path of knowledge involves discipline, study, and meditation. Meditation may involve focusing on a passage from a sacred text or repeating a mantra. The path of action involves the performance of man's duties and responsibilities, or sadhamo. One is compelled to act by the rewards that performing these duties brings. But such rewards and satisfaction are only temporary and bind the individual to the cycle of rebirth. The path of devotion involves a complete surrender to Krishna, the supreme deity. Krishna is believed to be able to assume human form. In this way, he can form personal relationships with people who are liberated through grace.
Quite often, Hinduism has been compared with Christianity through the doctrine of God's coming down in human form. Christianity talks of the incarnation, that is the enfleshment, coming down in the flesh of incarnation of God in the form of Jesus. Hindus also talk of avatara, which is a Sanskrit word meaning exactly that, coming down, embodying. And mainly in the Vaishnava tradition, there's a developed theology of God coming down in embodied form. Notice I say embodied form because whereas in Christianity, God came down in human form, in Hinduism, God can be embodied in human and non-human forms. And so the doctrine of avatara, or God's descent, has been explained in terms of human embodiment in the person of Krishna and the person of Rama, but also in animal form, the fish, the tortoise, and so on. And this is a way that Hindus show that God is immanent in the world, that there is no dimension of creation which in a way cannot manifest or display the power of God. It also may show that those forms of life we consider inferior, let's say subhuman forms of life, seem to be striving for completion and perfection in human forms. And there is a kind of continuity between the two. Another difference between the doctrine of incarnation and avatar is that for Christians, the incarnation can take place only once, and it's taken place in Jesus of Nazareth. But for Hindus, there are multiple avatars, and each age, each cultural epoch can have its own avatars, its own presence of God among us in order to guide us and lead us towards our fulfillment.
One Hindu practice that has been absorbed into Western culture is yoga. This physical form is called Hatha Yoga. In the 1960s, the Beatles famously became disciples of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. He practiced a form of yoga called transcendental meditation. Yoga is a classical system of philosophy.
Yoga, of course, has become extremely popular in the West. And it's interesting that the popularization of yoga began in the second half of the 19th century. And since then, it's really something that has been accepted in the West as an accredited way of achieving peace, achieving integration, achieving a sense of well-being or health. Now, this all goes back to about 2,000 years to a text called the Yoga Sutra, which is ascribed to a sage called Patanjali. This is not a very long text. It's written in verse form. It's written in Sanskrit, and it's got about 190 verses or so in it. And in that text, it describes various postures, asanas. It describes some of the thinking behind these postures. What's come through in the Western appreciation of yoga really is the physical side, the postures, the integration of the physical and biological part of us. But in the Yoga Sutras, there's also a spiritual side and a theoretical side, which has been left behind in much Western involvement with yoga. The Yoga Sutra has a complete philosophy of the self.
Hindus have long recognized the sanctity of nature. It is Hinduism that has given us the expression sacred cow. The cow is identified with Mother Earth and embodies the benevolence of the gods. Cows are often given as precious gifts in Hindu ceremonies. The Hindu calendar is crammed with festivals, fasts, and holy days. During the rainy season, from July to November, Vishnu is believed to sleep. The responsibility for running the world passes to humans. This is the season of fasts. The key festivals celebrate the triumph of good over evil and light over darkness. One of the most widely observed is Diwali, or the Festival of Lights.
Diwali is one of the most popular celebrations or festivals of Hinduism, and pretty universal throughout most of India and wherever Hindus live outside India. Another name for Diwali, which will indicate what it's about, is Deepavali, and that is the festival of lights. A deepa is a light, is a flame which is burnt in a wick in oil. So, as the name indicates, it's celebrated at a time when the period of darkness is beginning to give way to the period of light in the sacred calendar of the Hindus, and is often or usually in October. At that time, the new period of the sacred calendar is taking place when the god awakes, and when the period of light and the period of illumination in the Hindu's life takes place. Associated with it is the goddess Lakshmi, who is the giver of wealth and prosperity. And some communities, especially traders and business folk, often start new financial books at that time. After all, Lakshmi is the giver of wealth and prosperity, and therefore it makes sense to do that, and they revere her in particular. Most people celebrate it by letting off fireworks, by lighting candles or these oil lamps in their homes, in their houses, along the parapet of their of terraces and so on. And the city area or village can actually be extremely beautiful to look at with all these lights lit up. It's a celebration of great joy and a great happiness, and it symbolizes how light masters darkness and how we need to live in the light, actually, in terms of illumination, in terms of God's enlightening of ourselves.
Many festivals, such as Pongal and Holi, are connected with the changing seasons. All festivals are designed to harmonize with the rhythms of the cosmos.
Hinduism is increasingly becoming well known outside India, and this has taken place really in the last 100, 150 years. And this has happened in all sorts of ways. I can think of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the guru who was associated with the Beatles, for example, and transcendental meditation. In other words, this was a form of yoga. And that leads us to regard the role of yoga in the Western consciousness. Yoga has played an increasingly big role as the source of well-being, alternative medicine, health, and so on. It's really now taken on board as a pretty common practice among Westerners. Yoga means integration, and therefore it's a means, a device to integrate ourselves, not only on the physical level, but as a whole human being. Who hasn't heard of Mahatma Gandhi, who played such an important role in the transfer of power from British rule to Indian independence, and indeed in the creation of modern India, and his tremendous leadership in terms of non-violence and peace. And in fact, the transfer of power between the British and Indians could have been much more violent than it was. So Gandhi is regarded as a moral giant of our times, and he gave credibility and tremendous impetus to the role of non-violence in an increasingly violent world. But I think one of the most important contributions Hinduism can make to the West is just the celebration of life, the riot of color, the festivals, the enjoyment of life, the combination of detachment with engagement, the sophisticated myths and stories and explanations of this, the whole understanding of what it is to be a complete person in terms of all the different forces and powers that are at work inside us and outside us. The marrying together of everything in a way that makes life an adventure is really what Hinduism has contributed in these various forms, and I think will contribute as the world becomes more and more globalized for a long time to come.
The road to Buddhahood is open to all. At all times, all living beings have the germ of Buddhahood in them. There have been many Buddhas, and there are many more to come. It is generally agreed, though, that the last Buddha was Siddhartha Gautamas. There are many versions of the Buddha's life story. According to a Buddhist text of the 5th century AD, there once lived a man named Sumed. He met with Dipankar, who was Buddha, many eons ago. Sumed said that he wished to become a Buddha. He became a bodhisattva, one who seeks enlightenment, and went through many incarnations, perfecting himself in each life. For his final incarnation, he chose as his mother Queen Maya, wife of the king of the Shakyas in Nepal. His final birth was miraculous.
It's said, I don't believe this myself, but it's said that this birth was, well, it's been called a very auspicious birth. And there's various, it's told in various different ways, but one of the descriptions is that she had the Buddha to be, the baby, standing up holding a tree. And well, there's one version has that he came out of her side, out of her right side. And another version has that she stood up and again holding this tree. And she was on her way to her mother's court, I should say. So it was just in the middle of the journey, the birth suddenly happened. And Another version has that she died there and then while holding the tree. There's another version that she was absolutely fine and went back to her palace because she never got to her mother's, which actually in India is a traditional way of doing it. The wife goes to her former home to have the child. So who knows quite what to believe. I don't believe he came out of her side, and I don't think many self-respecting Buddhists probably do believe that, but that was one of the mythical tales, you could say. But overall, I think all Buddhists believe that it was an auspicious event that he was born. So, and at that point he was called Siddhartha, Prince Siddhartha.
When he was about 30, he left the court and his wife to live the life of an ascetic. After 6 years, he found enlightenment while sitting beneath a banyan tree, a Bodhigaya.
It does seem that it was quite a tremendous event, from whichever account you look at. And he did definitely feel for himself that he'd understood something that hadn't been understood in this era before, but that he also intuited it had been understood by Buddhas in the past. So, and at first, shortly after that, he was wondering whether it would be possible to teach. The accounts say that he felt very alone after he'd just realised this great truth, and he thought, but it's so profound, it's so hard to see, who on earth is going to understand? And for a while he thought, well, he wouldn't teach. But then he realised there were certain people quite further advanced on the path, particularly the two teachers who'd offered to share their communities with him. He thought, well, they might understand because they're quite close. So that was what he decided to do.
During the next 40 years, he taught, gathering around him a growing band of disciples. It is said that his teaching was a reaction against the teaching of the Veds and sacrificial practices.
It was a time of great experimentation in India at that time. There were an awful lot of spiritual seekers trying all sorts of things. Some were thinking that the route to salvation was through mortifying the flesh or somehow getting beyond the body. So there were quite a lot of people practicing austere practices like standing on one leg for hours on end or meditating at the hottest time of day, and things that were really quite painful, you could say. Eating very little was a common one. There were other people who were practicing all sorts of sacrificial practices, fire worshippers, animal sacrifice, different things like that, or people into ritual purification through washing in rivers and so on. And again, the Buddha probably tried most of these, but he wasn't convinced that these had any bearing on the mind or being able to see the truth. So he afterwards said that those were all different extremes, and what he taught was a middle way. Particularly, he taught a middle way between the extreme of believing there was an eternal soul that carried on from life after life, or believing that this life was all there was, which is more a nihilistic approach. And that he said that there was something in between those. People currently believe there was either it all ended at death of this life, or it went on forever and ever. And he said those aren't the only options. So in that sense, what he called his middle way between those two was really quite radical.
Buddhism became a monastic religion. About the 8th century AD, it came into conflict with Hinduism, following Muslim invasions from the north. Towards the end of the 12th century, Buddhist universities throughout India were sacked, and Buddhism almost disappeared. Buddhism survived because monks and travelers had taken the Buddha's teachings all over Asia. It has taken root in such countries as China, Tibet, and Korea because the Buddha's Dharma, or truth, appeals to everyone. There are no barriers of race or class in Buddhism, and it has been open to the influence of local custom and belief.
Buddhism seems to have adapted itself to many different types of culture around the world, but what doesn't change are its principles. How those principles are expressed does change in all sorts of ways, and you can see the host culture is used as a vehicle for expressing timeless truths. I think in particular for us in the West, it's important to see that we don't have to wear robes and go out with a begging bowl and shave our heads in order to practice the truths that the Buddha was teaching. Those are much more Asian accretions, they're Asian customs that aren't that relevant to really what he was teaching. And I think that's quite important because people can be off-put by the externals, but those aren't really what it's about at all.
The Buddha is perceived to be neither human nor God. He transcends the nature of both. His teaching offers a solution to the fundamental problem of the human condition. Nothing is permanent. Happiness doesn't last. There will always be suffering and death. This state is known in Buddhist teaching as dukkha. The first step on the road to enlightenment is to recognize this. There is nothing negative or pessimistic about this recognition. I teach only dukkha and the cessation of dukkha. Once the cessation of dukkha has been achieved, the Buddhist attains nirvana, the eradication of greed, hatred, and delusion. Buddhists believe a natural law governs the spiritual world as the material world is governed by physical law. This natural law is called karma. The law of karma states that every deed ripens with time. This will affect whether one's future rebirths are favorable or unfavorable. There is a moral and natural dimension to karma.
This is a big and quite complex topic. One way you could sum it up is that actions have consequences. Everything we do, and that includes every thought we have and every word we speak as much as every sort of activity or deed, will have an effect. It'll have an effect on our minds, and it'll probably have an effect on the outside world or other people. To say exactly what effect that has is hard to quantify or evaluate, but it is the law of cause and effect, simply. One thing leads to another. But often there's more than one cause for any given result. So it is very hard to break down into sort of neat examples, you could say. One analogy I quite like was the Buddha was saying that angry words will have an effect. I mean, every word has an effect, but he likened if one throws a hot coal in anger at somebody, it will have an effect. And the first effect is that you'll burn your own hand before the person you're trying to throw the hot coal at. And that is an example of how one's own states of mind affect oneself as much as externally.
The Buddhist travels along the path leading to the cessation of dukkha by means of bhavan, or meditation. This is based on two methods, shamatha, or calm, and vipassana, or insight.
There are an awful lot of different types of meditation that the Buddha enumerated. I think there were 40 or thereabouts. But broadly, they're all aiming to develop awareness. And we use that awareness to understand the nature of the mind. So we don't use that awareness like the other practitioners of his day just to enjoy meditative bliss, although that might be a fruit on the way. But it's more to understand the nature of the mind and see more deeply into life. So firstly, developing awareness, that's the primary aim of meditation. And another very important aim would be to develop positive emotion, to be more kind, to develop warmth, friendliness, goodwill to all human beings. Well, no, not just human beings, to all beings, creatures and as well. So this isn't just a nice idea. It becomes a powerful meditation practice, and it's one of the practices we do developing positive emotion and directing that goodwill and warmth and friendliness to all beings. This meditation practice is called the metta bhavana. Metta means love or loving kindness, and we systematically have a way of cultivating that. That's one of our primary practices in my order and in many other traditions. The other, possibly the best known of all Buddhist meditations, is called the mindfulness of breathing. And that's when you focus on the breath and observe it coming and going. And as you observe the breath coming in and going out, the mind is stilled and concentrated to an ever refined point. And with both of those, they sound very different, but they become more and more similar the more one concentrates, the more one understands them. And both of those develop a very powerful positive awareness of oneself and the world. And one uses this awareness to then try and understand more deeply the truths of life.
Both monks and laity undertake the 5 precepts, which are the basis of all Buddhist ethics. The first precept is not to take or destroy life. The second is not to steal. The third is to avoid sexual misconduct. The fourth is to abstain from false speech. The fifth is to abstain from alcohol and all drugs that cloud the mind. Monks and nuns must follow 5 additional precepts. They must abstain from eating and drinking after midday, from dancing and singing, from personal adornments, from using high seats or beds, and from handling gold and silver. After the Buddha's death, his disciples began to preserve his teachings. A council was held in what is now Rajgir. An established version of the Dharma was created. Rules of monastic conduct were drawn up. These were memorized and passed on orally. The only text to have survived in an ancient Indian language is the Pali Canon.
The Pali Canon is, you could probably call it the Buddhist version of the Bible. It's the oldest recorded teachings of the Buddha. Not actually written down during his day, but it is the earliest version that there is. So you have a large section which is about his teachings, discourses, stories and parables. And then you have a chunk which came a little later, which is code of conduct for monks and nuns. And then there's a third section which is more analytical, philosophical, which analyzes the nature of mind and Buddhist teachings.
In Japan, a different form of Buddhism developed: Zen. It is the form best known in the West, although fewer than 10% of Japanese Buddhists practice it.
Well, the Zen emphasis is on simplicity and meditation. It's strong on discipline. It reflects the Japanese culture that it developed or grew up in. Zen meditators, for instance, generally sit facing a bare white wall. So it's a more stark variation, you could say, on the Mahayana tradition that it grew out of. It emphasizes bringing spiritual practice into everyday activities. So it's about bringing awareness to the washing up, bringing awareness to brushing one's teeth. And in some cases, for instance, one of the well-known habits or practices is making tea, and the Zen tradition has made that into a highly elaborate art known as the Zen tea ceremony. So it's just bringing an enormous amount of awareness and attention to detail to what you could call everyday activities, and therefore imbuing them with, well, more satisfaction, making them more complete.
The name Zen means meditational absorption. Zen's founder is a monk called Bodhidharma. Legend has it that he sat in meditation for so long that his legs fell off from lack of use. Perhaps the best-known Buddhist in the world today is the Dalai Lama. Since the 17th century, the Dalai Lama has been the ruler and spiritual leader of Tibet. When a Dalai Lama dies, monks travel all over Tibet in search of a successor. This is usually a child. He is known by his ability to recognize certain religious artifacts. In 1950, the Chinese army invaded Tibet and tried to wipe out Buddhism. The present Dalai Lama, the 14th, fled the country and has lived in exile ever since.
Well, certainly from my own point of view, I think being a Buddhist in the modern West is about learning to make life seem more meaningful and more precious. It includes developing awareness, as I've mentioned, looking for contentment and mindfulness in any moment. So maybe that would be about living more simply. It's not about any particular lifestyle as far as I'm concerned, but it is about the quality of that life rather than the external facts of that life. So it might involve not getting caught up in the rat race because of the mental attitudes that tend to go with that. But people and members of our order work in all sorts of fields and lifestyles. It isn't necessarily about that. It's about one's attitude, the attitude that you bring to any activity. I think it involves being faithful to friends. Friendship's prized very highly in Buddhism and in our order in particular. It involves learning to communicate with all people, irrespective of race or creed or culture, because all beings are to be respected. Respecting all life, I suppose, that's one of the fundamental principles. And also the Buddha said that every single being had the potential for enlightenment, regardless of your gender or race or creed, as I say. So that it's on that basis that we try and relate to everybody, that they have the potential for great wisdom and great compassion.
To Western eyes, Hinduism and Buddhism may seem the very opposite of all that is logical and rational. Yet many in the West have embraced them and found in them a source of enlightenment. They also continue to challenge the way we look at reality.